before we start talking about what service line is and how it may be able to help you, I kind of want to poll the room just a little bit. So who here is directly responsible either as an analyst or a manager or otherwise overall responsible for a security operations center? Okay. So we have a significant amount of people here, and that's good because I want to ask you a question that I'm going to circle back to here in a little bit. And the question that I want to ask is, what is your greatest obstacle for continued evolution of your service, right? So I don't think I've ever walked into a SOC, and I've walked into a lot of them, where they are exactly where they want to be and have no intention of ever growing past that or ever growing forward. What I have done is I've walked into a lot of SOCs where they had ideas on where they wanted to go, but for the most part, they couldn't get there for whatever reason. And this is going to bring up the concept that you'll hear a couple times in this about a maturity barrier. At its core essence, the Cyber Defense Center service line is designed to help organizations get past that barrier. So for the sake of an agenda, I'm going to keep it pretty quick. I know the Oktoberfest is coming up right after mine, and so I don't want to keep anybody from arguably the best part of the day. But that being said, I do want to cover three main areas. I want you guys to leave with an understanding of what our Cyber Defense Center Transformation Service Line is. I want you to take into account how it may be able to help you. And then on top of that, towards the second half of this presentation, I want to talk about an organization that's a hypothetical, but a hypothetical built on real-world experience, and present you with a client that presents challenges that we've faced in the past as a transformation service line. And so at the end of that, what I want you guys to take into consideration, and I'll ask you a little bit later in the presentation kind of what your obstacles are, what your maturation challenges are, but I want you to take those concepts in mind and think about how the service line may be able to assist you in the future. So as I mentioned, the joke keeps running, and the marketing team has a great sense of humor, so that's how we got to the infinity and beyond. They wouldn't actually let me wear the suit, so the picture's the next best thing. So just to introduce myself a little bit, my name is Nicolas Slaughter. I am the manager here over the CDC service line as part of our Strategic Transformation Services offering. I've been with Mandiant for about 4.5 years, but my background prior to that comes from building out SOCs, building on incident response teams, and different organizations along those lines. We've been very fortunate in following kind of where we do in the overall Mandiant FireEye structure, that we are both in a place of high technicality as well as strategic consulting. What this does is it allows us to really kind of practice what we preach in our day-to-day operations as we're going through and helping out our clients. So to present a bit more about what the service line is, we put together a small video for you, so we'll play that now, and then afterwards we'll talk a bit more about the details.
Today's cyber adversaries disrupt the ability of traditional security operations centers, or SOCs, to detect, respond, and remediate incidents quickly and effectively. This exposes the organization to greater business risk and costly consequences. The hub of a modernized SOC is its Cyber Defense Center, which provides deep understanding of threat indicators and the intelligence you need to make better risk-based security decisions. But many organizations lack the ability to do this effectively due to undertrained or overextended security staff, gaps in the technology and intelligence, or lack of a strategic program vision. The FireEye Mandiant Cyber Defense Center Development Service solves these security challenges. We help your organization develop and improve rapid threat detection, containment, and remediation capabilities before potential threats become harmful, headline-making breaches. Mandiant consultants are on the front lines of global incident response every day. We combine our unique expertise with purpose-built FireEye technology and threat intelligence to help your security operations center succeed and become resilient. Through strong collaboration with our clients, this service applies a holistic methodology of process and technology that maps directly to the organization's business goals and supports an adaptive defense strategy. We provide both short and long-term options to improve your overall security posture, cyber defense center techniques, and strategic SOC investments. And Mandiant consultants stay connected by advising your team on security concerns and best practices until your staff feels ready to work on their own. And we partner closely with you to ensure the engagement timeline is customized to meet your specific business needs. To learn more about this service and how it can advance your organization's Security Operations Center, visit fireeye.com/services. Today's cyber adversaries disrupt the ability of traditional.
You got a 1.5 there of the video. But the idea behind it, and ultimately, when we talk about trying to boil down what we do from a cyber defense center perspective and transformation service line, is to boil it down into a single sentence. The goal of it is to found partnerships with our clients in order to help them create an intel-led, proactive security operations center type org. Because the reactive is kind of a given, right? Every incident response organization, response is in the name. But being more proactive and being more focused on meeting adversaries before they're inside your network is a big push of what we're trying to accomplish. Oh, looks like I've gone all the way back to the front. Sorry about that, guys. So where do we fall in the overall FireEye ecosystem? I know that you guys have seen this slide probably a bunch of times on all the different tracks today, but we fall in the services category, but only in the most formal way possible. Because the Cyber Defense Center service line, the transformation services that we do, ties into everything that we have in terms of a FireEye ecosystem. Not only are we focused on the services of consulting and transformation advisory, we're also doing the hands-on keyboard for a lot of our technical stack and working with a lot of our technical teams to help build that out. And in addition to that, we're very focused on how we can implement in FireEye intelligence into our offerings overall. So we kind of fall somewhere in the middle there in terms of what our integration and egress points are in terms of services. So I realize the title of this slide is pretty blunt and yeah, I get it in terms of its messaging. But we really want to focus on the fact that not only is operationalizing security difficult, but in the incident response world and the security operations world, it's even more so. To some of the people that raised their hand about being in a SOC, is anybody willing to kind of poll about some of the challenges that you guys are currently seeing? Like what your most pressing obstacles are? Oh yeah, absolutely, I completely agree. And we had a conversation earlier today where I think the number of like 5.4 million jobs are currently just sitting out there in the information security world that are currently being unfulfilled. And so you're always going to have a bit of a talent shortage. You're always going to have that issue of having to train and having to deal with attrition. But it bleeds over into larger issues than just that, right? Not only do you have to worry about attrition, but then you also have to worry about, do you have the documentation to help the new person that's going to come in to replace your old person? Do you actually have the processes set up that way? Do you have the right IAM on the back end to make sure that the new person who's coming on board doesn't have a ramp-up time of 4 to 6 weeks? They can hit the ball rolling and get going in about a week. Most organizations that we go into simply don't have a lot of this stuff in place. And I say most organizations, I mean probably about half struggle with being able to actually bring on new people and people that are replacing old attrition. Then there's on top of that the fact of how do you make it an interesting job? How do you make a tier 1's job interesting long term? How do you give them maturation and career paths? So every one of these issues has multiple layers underneath it that you have to actually address. Anytime we talk about everything from alerting or even incident response, if you look at incident response as a challenge and you say we have a problem responding to incidents, well, let's take a couple steps back. Are you even taking into account risk in your incident response models? Are you taking into account the data that resides on the machines that you're responding to, or are you just trusting the SIM to use the out-of-the-box rules to tell you how critical an alert is, right? Every one of these areas where I'd say operationalizing security is difficult, it's kind of an understatement because when it comes to incident response and when it comes to security operations, it's threefold more difficult because there's multiple layers underneath it that you have to address. Traditional SOCs that typically will call our services in the traditional model either have one or more of these challenges where it kind of boils down to a couple of things. Either they lack the expertise to do it, they lack the understanding of what they should be doing, or most of the time, many times, they lack the actual cycles to actually get it done, right? Everybody, and this is one of the things that everybody on my team and everybody who's ever had to work with me is tired of hearing, but everybody has a day job. And if you're responding to incidents all day long, the idea that you're supposed to wear multiple hats and also be the security engineer and solve all the problems and solve all the processing issues and the documentation, it becomes kind of a faint background when you're constantly dealing with fires every day. And so operationalizing is very difficult, but on many different levels. And when we talk about why organizations don't actually evolve, it comes back to that maturity barrier we were talking about, right? These different areas, these different tangents where operationalizing it becomes difficult, act as roadblocks to prevent you from being able to actually mature to what you would consider the capstone of whatever level or whatever industry vertical you're in. Granted, not every SOC is created equal, not everyone has the same goals. We understand that and we respect that. But they should be able to actually meet the goals that you have and be able to continue to evolve without necessarily running into these maturity barriers that just shut down operations. I can't tell you the number of times that I've walked into a SOC and they've had a project that would fundamentally change the way they would do things and make everything so much better, but it hasn't moved in the better part of a year because they didn't have the people to do it. They didn't really know how to do it. The person who was supposed to do it left or was let go or whatever reason through attrition. And so it compounds on top of itself, and that's really where we come in to help out. So kind of giving a solution overview of what we do, we provide resources to help solve these maturity barriers and overcome them. Everything from what we consider a foundations pack of services, which would be things like helping out with playbooks and use cases and incident response plans, all the way to things like building up a unified incident management framework for multiple organizations that are blending together. In fact, the hypothetical client that we have is the result of a mergers and acquisition. We run into this situation where multiple organizations are coming together, and because of that, they have to completely rebuild from the ground up their entire framework on how they're going to do incident response, because what may have worked for one isn't necessarily going to work for another. We also focus on breaking out of the traditional model of one size fits all. I can't tell you the number of times in previous lives before I was at Mandiant where a consulting org would come out, they would give us the same solution that they gave the previous client before them, the previous client before them, and all the way back. You got a stack of documentation, and then they just left you to deal with it. Whenever they checked in 6 months, they were like, well, have you actually implemented the things that we've talked about? And your response is, no, I didn't have the manpower then. What makes you think I have the manpower now? We didn't have the tools and techniques and processes then. You just gave us documentation to follow. Why would we have that now? So what we're trying to do with the transformation service and what we are accomplishing with a lot of our clients is acting more as a long-term partnership with them in something we call a trusted advisor role. So when we talk about the maturity barrier challenge just a bit more, it is a matter of a combination of factors. We talk about overcoming complacency and insurmountable odds, but really it's a matter of spinning wheels. Organizations have a struggle, as we mentioned before, to push forward, and so we come behind to help kind of push the cart up the hill. And in order to do so, we look at organizations by milestone and try to establish where they are early on in the process. So in looking at it from trying to assess what their capabilities are, we look at it from a foundational perspective first. Does the organization have some key elements in play? Do they have repeatable processes? Is there a tool-based approach to security ops, or is everything, I've got to go log into this system, then I've got to go log into this system, and 4 or 5 systems later, they make it to solve the problem? Is there dedicated security staffing that is actually dedicated to incident response? Or is every member of your team wearing 6 hats and they'll circle back to incident response whenever they can, right? And then obviously when you look for what actually motivates the organization, a lot of times it's just compliance-driven or audit-driven. Is this what the regulators require? Is this what we're required to accomplish from a compliance standpoint? And if you're looking at it from that, it's hitting the baseline of what the auditors need at the end of the day. Moving kind of into the middle section, which is where we find most of our clients at, we see that people move into an evolving framework. right? They're moving between the reactive and proactive stages. It's not just about meeting the minimum baseline that the auditors require anymore. It's about what can we be doing to be proactive in responding to incidents before they become breaches. What can we be doing in terms of red teaming, pen testing, threat hunting overall, that to actually move forward and kind of move the needle up towards the proactive standpoint. This is where I find the majority of our customers live, because organizations that typically need the help are either going to be at the foundational level, where they just need to get a completely blank slate start, or they know they need to mature, they know they need to evolve, but they just need help getting there. And then finally, we have what we consider the resilient clients. And the resilient clients are the clients that are pretty sure they have everything figured out, or are pretty sure they're advanced compared to their peers. And we have a lot of organizations where we walk into and deal with a resilient client, and they have a completely different set of obstacles and changes. Now, does it mean that a foundational client is somehow worse or less than a resilient client? Not necessarily. The different organizations, depending on their size and industry vector and the industry vertical that they happen to be in, are going to have different challenges. So for example, a foundational client may be small and agile. They may be able to make changes by just going and talking to Todd over in the other cubicle. And so they may be equally as effective as an organization twice their size because of their agility. We walk into a lot of clients where capability, maturity, and effectiveness are two different things. They may not have repeatable processes written down and documented because no one's ever had time to do it, but I guarantee you they're going to stop the alerts when they come in. John's going to get up at 2 in the morning because he got an alert from the FireEye module 5 minutes earlier, and they're going to get on it and solve it. There's a lot of organizations out there that are foundational that are still very effective. Then when you move up to the resilient chain, you typically run into these large, massive corporations where just getting a new technology tool in requires 6 different approvals from 6 different teams and can take you 6 different months to get it done. And so what they make up for in maturity and what they make up for in more sophisticated tool sets, they can lose in some other elements such as agility. So what we typically try to do is we try to focus on the elements of how we can help each of these clients. So for something like foundational clients, we may simply come in and focus on what we can help them do to get the most bang for their buck. If they're lacking documentation, we can assist with documentation. If they are over inundated with alert tuning, we can assist with that. We try to be as vendor agnostic as possible and technology agnostic so that we can come into any organization and be able to help out and assist. On my team alone, I think we have something like 4 SIMs covered in terms of actual engineering and what we can do from a team. And so we try to be as technology agnostic as possible. Obviously, we work very well with our own FireEye stack and FireEye products and products like Federated, but we try to make sure that we are as technically capable of bringing expertise to the table for any level of organization. So then we kind of start talking about the areas of focus. So this is specifically for, or especially for, a lot of our longer-term transformation projects. What we do from the initial onset for most of our longer-term transformation projects is we start at the bottom and work our way up with the capabilities assessment and the capability evaluation. This lets us understand truly and fully where an organization actually sits. Worked with a company once that when we went on site with them to talk about how we could help out during the initial scoping calls, they said they had something like 20, 25 people in their SOC. They had 2 different SOCs. One was in one state, one was in the state just above it. They had Splunk with enterprise security, and then the enterprise security module had been completely set up with pro services, and they had spent a couple $100,000 getting that set up, and that they were absolutely logging everything. So we walk in thinking this is going to be pretty easy, pretty great. The reality of it is when we get on site that those 20, 25 people were previously security guards. They had predominantly been watching security cameras, and they said, okay, well, these must be completely transferable to cybersecurity. And so they put them all into the SOC and was like, good luck. I mean, maybe 3 or 4 of them actually had cybersecurity experience. The Splunk instance that they had set up, yeah, it was great if it actually worked and somebody remembered the password, because the guy who had set it all up, he quit 3 years prior, and so no use cases had actually been put into the account. No actual new alerts or tuning had actually been done on the product, so they weren't using it. And yes, they did capture logs from everything, but only kept them for about 30 days because of regulatory issues and concerns there. And so then they would archive them out to where it was untouchable for the SOC. So we do capability evaluation to better understand the realistic landscape that we're walking into. Because more often than not, it helps people to understand who are too close to the problem what the actual problems are. Because the closer you are to a problem, the less you see the nuances of what the actual issues are that can be solved. Moving past this, we focus on kind of a design and build phase, which is where we address the problems, we understand what the problems are through the capability evaluation, and even if they aren't necessarily directly the problems that we were brought on to solve, the client, after looking at it and understanding, these are actually the trouble areas we think that you need to address, may change it up on us and say, well, look, we actually need to focus on these fundamental areas. And after all those conversations are done, the design and build phase comes on board. Design is a collaborative effort. Any solution that we're going to design, anything that we're going to build out, and breaking away from the traditional consulting model of we'll build it and hand you a document and tell you how to use it, we try to be as collaborative as possible throughout the entire process. We want to work with your teams to understand what will actually work. Because we can tell you what the pie in the sky model is, we can tell you what best practices are, and we're always going to strive for best practices, but we need to make sure it's going to functionally work for you. And so every part of the design and build phase is done in tandem with our clients and done in a way that promotes a unity and a unified effort in doing it. The last thing I want to do is drop off a deliverable or drop off something that we have for a client and it only meet half the requirements. Finally, the last phase that we're looking for is Cdc Implementation and Testing. This is where we're actually boots on the ground and helping to implement throughout the process. Some organizations don't necessarily need this level of it, but at the same time, most other organizations that we are doing long-term transformation projects with, like the hypothetical that I'm going to bring up here shortly, like to bring us on site because we've done so much of the design and build at that point. It's just kind of a natural fit to bring us on to see it through to the end. So what is the Mandiant difference? The Mandiant difference is threefold, as it shows on the screen. Being a trusted advisor is a couple of things. Number one, I don't know of a single consulting opportunity that we've gone out and been on site where the organization couldn't pick the phone back up and call us to say, we need to continue something here, we need to continue development or something along those lines. I think that more often than not, what happens is our clients, even if we wrap up a project, have the ability to pick up the phone and say, we need additional work. It's not a done and forget. We maintain a relationship with our clients long term and try to make sure we establish and keep that line of communication up. In addition to being a trusted advisor, a lot of our more recent CDCs are becoming very long, protracted engagements. We've been doing this for a while, and a lot of our regions have been doing this for a while. But overall, we're seeing a lot of transformation engagements that are lasting anywhere between 1 month, 3 months, and all the way up to 6 months, where the client is wanting us to stay out on site with them long term. And by being a trusted advisor, that doesn't mean checking in on them every 3 weeks. That means actually checking in and having weekly phone calls, or more often cadence if that's what the client needs in order to get the job done. It means being communicative with our clients and making sure that we're establishing a cadence that works to help promote that unification of development that we talked about. And moving over to the expertise and experience, this is where we talked about a little bit earlier in that we fall right in the sweet spot between technical and strategic resources. When we look at our technical side, we have our IR guys, and everybody knows Mandiant IR, right? You've seen either the technical tracks, you've been to the keynotes. The Mandiant IR team has a vast wealth of experience and expertise that we can trigger for all of these engagements and bring on for solutions that may be either advanced, sophisticated, or simply be something that nobody's seen before. By partnering with our technical resources, we're able to make the overall engagement substantially more technical than something that would be purely strategic or that could be considered something where it's not complex in nature, right? Our strategic resources are all very technical, very qualified, very experts in their field as well. But having that balance between the actual IR and what's happening on the front lines and being able to bring that strategic consulting experience into the strategic side of it and being able to actually have those conversations map out and plan out those logistics and actually do all of the groundwork, it brings together a nice pairing that really sets our service line apart in terms of our competitors. And then finally, we have access to all of the FireEye tool suite. We obviously have access to FireEye Intelligence. We have access to Helix. We work very well in our own elements. And by having access to these tools and by having access to these components, we're able to bring them to fold to meet a lot of the problems that we see out in the world. So this is a bit how we pair up with our other services. Pairing up with Expertise on Demand is kind of a twofold element. On one side, it works very well for ad hoc requests. You can send up an Expertise on Demand request, and elements such as use case review, playbook development, these are all things that fit very nicely into Expertise on Demand. However, some of the real benefit of actually adhering to it and moving with Expertise on Demand with a Cyber Defense Center transformation service is that it provides ongoing support, right? From the threat intelligence access to the malware analysis components, these are niche roles that an organization may not have on their own. But by pairing with Expertise on Demand, they're able to functionally have access to these elements that they may not have otherwise in these tools. In working with Helix, we're able to do a lot of very interesting things, especially as Helix becomes better and better over time. In addition to being able to develop hunt books, we can actually have federated dashboard development, which allows us to focus on areas where multi-tenancy may be a requirement or data residency issues. In fact, for one of our clients, it's a really good fit because they have offices around the world that they don't necessarily have the ability to go in and log in to a single federated dashboard or a single pane of glass for their operations and organizations because they have data residency issues. By being able to take all of these different components and being able to take all these different localized challenges and put them into a single federated dashboard, they now have access to that single pane of glass for their Helix instance. Automation and integration, being able to develop out automated playbooks through Helix and FSO is just valuable overall because of the access and being able to take on a lot of the staffing challenges that we've talked about in the past. The more you can automate in an effective and reliable way, the less you need in terms of dedicated headcount, which those people can then be routed to doing things like actually helping to promote evolution overall. And then external intelligence feed contextualization. This is an element where we can actually take a lot of what we have from the Helix side and directly and immediately compare it to our FireEye intelligence suite to be able to understand better IOCs, better information and data enrichment about the events that we're seeing, which obviously leads to better response overall. Federated is a newer and very exciting element of cyber defense transformation overall. Because what Federated does is it allows us to, in real time, understand and evaluate how transformation and how the organization is maturing overall. So not only can it do the validation of technical controls, but being able to actually see in real time whenever you put a new tool in place or whenever you put a new element in place, to be able to see what impact that has on the security posture of the organization, to be able to actually challenge your security posture with a range of scenarios to actually provide testing to the organization and the organization's capabilities, that's just, the possibilities of that are limitless in terms of what you can actually do through combining this with Federated. So as I mentioned, the second half of this is going to be to focus on a hypothetical case study. And as I mentioned, while it is hypothetical, pretty much all the elements of this have been pulled from multiple different clients, and this is very similar to a series of transformation projects that we've had very recently. And so the idea here is that you have an organization that has two different SOCs. One is for the tier 1, tier 2 side of the house. One is for the tier 3 side. It's a financial organization that has about 200,000 endpoints, right? And then the challenge here is that the new CISO is coming on board and seeing on their line items that they have two different SOCs at two different cost points at two different line items on their expense report, right? And it's not showing a whole lot of value as to why they would have this set apart. The origin and kind of genesis of this is that the tier 1, tier 2 worked for a different group early on, and the initial incident response team worked for all the tier 3 stuff. And as they became more sophisticated, more advanced, got more training, they started focusing on tier 3 stuff, and way back when pushed everything basic over to the tier 1, tier 2 team, and that division kept happening over several years. And so because of that, the new CISO wants to understand why they're separate, why they're apart, and then pull them back together. So what this results into is two disparate groups entirely that have a full lack of communication between the two. In fact, they're not even in the same city. So because of that, there is no mentorship. There is no data transference aside of what happens in a ticket and what may happen in a quick email or phone call in terms of escalating challenges up. And then investigations aren't being performed by the entire SOC at once. It's happening piecemeal overall. And so obviously this represents a lot of problems. So then you move into some of the more costly elements of this. They have two different tech stacks entirely: case management system, SIEM, everything across the board that they would possibly need. They have two different tech stacks of. Some things are shared, but very begrudgingly. And so the idea was, how can we come in and help solve this problem? As I mentioned, we're very much focused on finding what the problems are that the organization faces as a maturity barrier and helping to resolve that so they can push forward. So the end state goal when we talked to the client was pretty simple across the board. They wanted to combine the two separate IR groups. They wanted to evaluate and identify the requirements that would go into actually doing this type of work, and understanding what the requirements of the tier 3 side and what the tier 1 and 2 side would actually have, what business obligations they already have in play. We see a lot of this type of work when we talk about mergers and acquisitions, where we bring two different organizations together. Each one has their own requirements and business obligations that they have to adhere to. And then the next objective is to actually develop out what we consider a unified incident management framework. How do we combine these two together? Everything from the ticketing process, whenever somebody opens up a new ticket, all the way down the process to how we handle incident response events, how we're doing after action studies, and how we're doing root cause analysis. And then finally, we need to test the new environment to make sure it actually works as well as it was designed to work. So the unification process took about 3 months for this, and what it resulted in was a pretty seamless integration of the two organizations together. Once we had a clear understanding of what the requirements were for us to adhere to and that we needed to have in order for the unified incident management framework to exist, we went through and we established kind of a baseline by evaluating each organization, the tier 1, tier 2 SOC, and the tier 3 SOC. By evaluating these independent of each other, we were able to see what the strengths and weaknesses were for each. We were able to understand what opportunities for growth one might have had, whereas the other one may have had some process or procedure they were doing perfectly and that could be adopted by the first. So it's easy to think that the tier 3 side, because they're the better trained, they have probably more resources thrown to it, that it would just be kind of a full adoption of what they were doing. But in fact, the tier 1, tier 2 side was handling consistently more alerts in a day, and they could scale much better than a more sophisticated response team, because they were used to actually having to handle the bulk of these tier 1, tier 2 events. They could scale up to double the capacity they were currently doing. So it's really a matter of identifying a baseline and understanding between the two offerings what the strengths and weaknesses of each are. Once we had that information, we had the requirements, we had to develop the unified incident management framework. So this meant we had to look at what technology was best in play and what technology we should be using and which one was the most well established, right? If the tier 1, tier 2 is using something like a ServiceNow implementation, and then you have the tier 3 using a more dedicated IR process, what makes the best sense there? What makes the best sense for us to move everybody over to? Does it scale well enough to take on the amalgamation of all the events that tier 1, tier 2 was doing and all the events that tier 3 is doing? Can you still maintain the confidentiality of it? Can you still keep the access restricted to who actually needed to know by going in and adopting one of the other cases or case management systems? If neither worked, do we need to evaluate something new? And that's something you have to take into consideration. Just because it always has worked doesn't mean it always will work. And so we defined out the unified incident management framework, and we came to an understanding, came to a design that worked well for the team. It was very important for us to be collaborative with the team throughout both the understanding of the strengths and weaknesses, and the actual design phases, because the design phases were going to set up the framework for how they were going to be building out and responding in the future, how everything was going to be happening going forward once we left. And so we spent a lot of time working with them to make sure that everything was considered, every possibility was squared away, and then we got it up and running and got it to where it was in a good place to where they could actually start moving things together and making that transition into a unified front. The fourth part of it is to make recommendations. In the event that we had this unified management framework down, but we had to make recommendations, we wanted to be very clear as to why. So in the event we say you need a new case management system, we want to provide justification as to why that is. I can't just justify, hey, Mandiant said we need to go out and buy a new case management system. We want to be able to provide enough information about what we're recommending and what we're requesting, people can go back and make educated pushes for it. And if they get stomped down and they need to reevaluate and kind of make another determination as to what route to go, we can help with that. But it's a matter of being able to make the recommendations and showing our work, so to speak, right? If we're going to make one solution recommendation, we need to provide justification as to why we didn't go another route. So after all of this, the client, the hypothetical client of many, many real-world elements, would have a full soup to nuts incident management framework for how they're going to be going through everything from the intake process. When somebody picks up the phone, who are they talking to? How does that ticket get tracked from point A to point B, all the way from tier 1 to tier 3? How do they handle a major incident? How do they handle things like off-the-wall incidents that they didn't typically get? If tier 1 is now having to handle things like tier 3 used to have to handle, how do they know when to escalate? Right, so all these things were fleshed out and framed out. We came up with a new incident management plan or incident response plan for them that helped to lay out a lot of those elements. So to kind of wrap this back on itself, we really want to help organizations focus on a couple things. So because we are a transformation service, and in addition to that, provide kind of a dedicated liaison support in terms of helping to promote that maturity and that transformation across, we focus on a couple key areas. We want to focus on maturity and operational effectiveness, right? How operationally effective is your organization, and then how mature are your processes that support that, right? So we want to be able to make sure that we're making a balance there. Like I said earlier, a foundational client may be extremely effective, but not very mature. A more resilient client may be extremely mature, but not very effective, depending on what challenges they have. So we want to focus on maintaining kind of a balance there between the two. So the second element of it is we provide partnerships for long-term support in terms of being able to help out a client. In the event that incident management framework that we developed out, they start seeing holes in it in 6 months, we want to be able to know enough about what we did in the past where we can go out and continue to help them out in the future and act as that trusted advisor. Like I said before, a lot of our engagements these days are running a bit long because clients like having us out there for a longer period of time to either act as a transformation liaison, to be out there for, one of my people is going to be out at a client site for about 3 months just to help them out and guide them through the maturation process overall. And so a lot of organizations like having that kind of advisor through the woods, so to speak. We also want to focus on better understanding the underlying challenges because, as I mentioned before, when we talked about the operationalizing security is hard, what you see on the surface may not actually be what the relevant challenges are underneath. If you're talking about being able to do incident response effectively, we have multiple dozens of questions that we're going to ask you to actually pull apart whether or not you're ready to be at the level you think you are, right? If you talk about being able to be a world-class SOC, one of my first questions is going to be, how aware of the data on your machines are you? Being able to actually focus on the underlying problems and being able to focus on what people have done, things like tracking down their digital crown jewels, being able to focus on elements like, does your team actually have the right training in place for this? Do we need to kind of route you back to the training? Do you have the right tools to actually be at the level of maturity that you want to be? And providing those recommendations on how you can get to that place. And then finally, as I mentioned before, we are technology agnostics. And by that, it just means that we're very proud of the fact that we can go into many different environments and work on whatever tool sets they have in place, or work with whatever tool sets they have in place. Obviously, we work very, very well with our own products, but we try to make sure that we're being as open to anybody who needs the assistance as we can be. And through that, we have ongoing efforts to make sure that our team is built out with a robust skill set that can support a lot of different technology stacks that are out there. So I know we only have about 9 minutes left, and like I said, I don't want to keep anybody from the event, but do we have any questions? Go ahead.
So you focused a lot on just within the enclave of SOC.
Sure.
Sure. But you focused a lot on just within the enclave of SOC and the dynamics within that team. What about the rest of the enterprise, though? How do you interact with them?
Sure.
A lot of times the SOC doesn't have security operational control over the enterprise. They
Right.
just have.
So the answer to your question is kind of twofold. We have a lot of consulting operations that works around how we help out with the overall set of domains that we have. Things like a security program assessment and a lot of the transformation activities that will happen at different levels like IAM, things of that nature. So from a consulting perspective, a lot of that is covered. We have a lot of services that focus specifically on that. With regards to how we help SOCs that necessarily don't have the challenges inside but are outside, so things like authority to act, so to speak, we need to make sure that when we're going on sites, and we stress this across the board, that we're working with the levels of people that can actually promote that. So in the event that a director brings this out or a manager brings this out, one of the first areas that we're going to talk about is finding out what authority they do have to act. So in the event they need to make a request to do an incident response case event or something along those lines that may need another team, we want to make sure that things like SLAs are established where you actually have and are adhered to because you have that authority to act. And so we want to partner with a lot of the other different organizations and then maybe the different business units that may be the problem points. We try to make an effort to help out and resolve those issues while we're there just by providing an objective standpoint. Now, granted, we can't solve every issue overnight, and realistically, some challenges run a lot deeper than what an outside consulting party can bring in. But by being able to provide an objective standpoint, it's not going to benefit us if you guys get access to this certain tool, right? But we think it's best practices, and in order for you guys to do your job at the incident response level, you have to have access to tool X, Y, or Z. We're going to make those recommendations, and we're going to make them in such a way that whenever the executive summary comes out at the end of the day, whenever we start talking about what we solved, it goes up to the highest level of people that we can get it to say, look, one of the biggest challenges you have is the incident response team doesn't have access to tool X, Y, or Z. And so we want to be as forthright and coming as possible when trying to promote what actually needs to occur in order for the other groups in the other areas to be cohesive with what we're trying to do from an incident response perspective. Yeah. Sorry, I think a microphone's on its way to you.
Hello?
Thank you. Will Mandiant be using the Federated tool as part of its being able to dive into a network?
Sure. So when we talk about Federated, because Federated is a newer acquisition, we have a lot of plans of integrating it into what we're doing from the CDC perspective. What I can tell you is that it's already well on the roadmap for how we're going to be getting that integrated in, and that we have some really, really sharp people working on how that's going to combine together. I do foresee us having a very close relationship with Federated long term, and in addition to what we can kind of already start to accomplish with them now, but I think that it's going to be a very cohesive element to what we're doing. I think it's one of the acquisitions that I'm most excited about in the time that I've been here, just because it makes such a natural, organic sense for them to combine together. Because I do think, to your point, being able to do things like actually firing off scenarios to test the effectiveness and efficacy of what you're doing, I think that's invaluable. So yes, I think long term, to that point, yes, it is definitely on the roadmap. Yeah.
So you mentioned that sometimes the SOC managers don't have the objectivity to see the problems. So when you come in, it's one of the values that you bring. Is there a recommendation you would have for SOC managers to take a step back on their own and try to get some of that objectivity?
Sure. Coming from the position of being a previous SOC manager and being kind of in the trenches with the team in a couple of roles now, I think that one of the big challenges you have is because you're so close to the problem and you're doing it on an everyday basis, it's hard to take that step back. Some recommendations that I would make in order to do that would be to look at best practices frameworks and see how far you are away from where you need to be if you don't match up to where they need to be. And then look at things like MITRE and see kind of what that's evaluating from the use case perspective, because it's very emergent, and what that's kind of pushing for in terms of what your SOC could be doing. Once you have that delta between what you could be doing and what you actually are doing, you're able to start taking stock of, okay, well, why aren't we doing A, B, C, D all down the line? And being able to look at it in terms of new projects and look at it in terms of something new into the element may break that cycle of being too close to the existing problems. That what it'll let you do is it'll let you have a little bit of hindsight to go back and say, okay, well, wait, the reason we can't do B is because we have these 3 or 4 problems that we haven't actually resolved yet. Maybe I need to go back and actually resolve B. It's kind of like being a homemaker and that old joke about you want to change the light bulb, you wind up replacing your oil filter just so you can get to the store to get the light bulb. So being able to actually go back and look and see what obstacles you have in play through maybe the lens of a different objective is pretty helpful in that regard. Very far back there, Shirley.
Are there particular metrics you are looking at to show success of your transformation?
Oh man, yeah. So I like metrics quite a bit. And with Mandiant, we had something called Drain CVR that we looked at for a while. And so I think those are being kind of reevaluated and worked on. But when looking at operational metrics, which is oftentimes the most effective metrics to look at to actually see whether or not you're maturing down the line, looking at things like dwell time, time to respond, time to action, time to actually contain, looking at those very fundamental operational metrics are pretty key. If you don't already have those baselines, I'd recommend you go back and get them pretty quick and actually see how long it takes your analyst to pick up and start back a step further, how long it takes for an event to come to your tier 1, how long it takes for your tier 1 to actually resolve it or escalate it up, and then how long it actually takes to get closed out. By looking at it and establishing that baseline early on, you're able to go through and as you're doing the new practices, as you're implementing the new processes, you're actually able to take very quantitative assessments on how you've changed and how you've actually increased the time. Now, granted, there's a lot of other metrics that you can use to kind of flesh that out a bit more, but from a very basic borderline perspective, I think those are sometimes the simplest to A, acquire, and B, to track. They have a lot better music than I got. So I know we only got about a minute left. And if there are no more questions, I just want to say, again, thank you very much for attending. I really appreciate it. I know it's been a long day for a lot of you, so I really do appreciate the time.